Thanks, Sally. This particular half-hour session is a bit of a demonstration, if you like, of the role that perhaps the CRC's played in a number of areas. Firstly, there are three speakers from three different parts of the world. Here is me, I'm just sort of setting the scene, and then we're having Grant Smith from Plant and Food in New Zealand, where TPP exists, and then finally Sonya, who has been holding the fort in Western Australia where TPP's been found. So I won't get into all the details or the history about how we got to where we are, just that we do know that the TPP, or Tomato Potato Psyllid, is in fact a global issue which is in the forefront of a number of people's minds, and now it's in the forefront of Australia. I guess the interesting thing is that even though TPP was found in Western Australia, it wasn't the first place in Australia. Norfolk Island was. And it's interesting to know that the CRC played a role there too. So in 2013, Tomato Potato Psyllid was found in Norfolk Island, and the CRC played a role in actually, on the advice of the department at the time, sought to have that reviewed, what was there, how that's changed in 12 months. And that was one of the initial sorts of projects that was led by Grant Smith, whom you'll hear in a sec. I guess the important thing here is that we hope to be able to demonstrate how the CRC has played a role where it was cross-sectorial and international. It was that we were able to bring together experiences from New Zealand, they have it, put it together with our need to be prepared and to see how we actually delivered that. I know in 2012 there was a contingency plan for TPP developed, and certainly when it all got exciting in Perth in February last year, that plan got rolled out. Now there's also lessons we can learn from that going forward, but I'm not going to spend any time on that right now. I think that in terms of the CRC, Grant's going to present to you a range of projects that the CRC invested in, and Sonya's then going to respond to how some of those things were used and how we can move forward from here. So I'll introduce Grant right now.
Thanks, Alan. So what I'd like to do is just present to you some of the learnings that we found in the projects. I'm also presenting this on behalf of my good colleague Jessica Verizon. So a lot of these slides are Jessica's from her entomological investigations of TPP in New Zealand, and then I'll follow up a little bit, expand a little bit more on about the diagnostics that we're doing as part of Jim Stack's big project that Brendan's already introduced. So the problem. So I think we all know what the problem is. It's tomato potato psyllid. It's a vector for an unculturable, relatively new to science bacterium, Candidatus Liberibacter solanacearum, which is the putative agent. So it's putative because we can't culture it, we can't establish Koch's postulates, but it's fairly clearly the pathogen causing zebra chip of potato, and it also infects a wide range of other solanaceous crops, but it also infects apiaceous crops as well. But we're not dealing with those ones today. It has caused significant economic loss to New Zealand's horticultural industry since its finding initially in 2006 up near Auckland, and then being found in glasshouses. The best estimates that we have right now from the New Zealand potato industry is that they reckon the cumulative cost of TPP Liberibacter in New Zealand potato industry is about 100 million per annum. That's total costs. It significantly reduces yield and affects quality, and is a significant problem wherever it's been found. In fact, it's largely put the Tamarillo industry out of action. So part of Jessica's project, CRC project 2079, was what other plant hosts are there for TPP in New Zealand. We know its hosts are in the solanaceous family, but there was this large knowledge gap around how it worked in terms of its ecology, going backwards and forwards between production crops and other hosts. So hopefully the one in the middle, if I got my memory right, is Poroporo from New Zealand, also known as kangaroo paw here in Australia. So what was found was basically that TPP has a wide range of host plants, which does present challenges for diagnosis, surveillance, eradication and management. You can, in Canterbury, which is where we are based, both Jessica and I, TPP, all life stages of TPP can be found on non-crop host plants, in particular boxthorn, throughout the year. So it's continuing to be active right through the full year. So even our winters aren't as tough as what you get in the continental US, but it's not slowing down. And Jessica's always made this point quite strongly where it talks I've been sitting in the audience on. These are not alternative hosts, they are hosts of this insect. And in Hawke's Bay, so up in the North Island, both Jerusalem cherry and thorn apple tested positive for the bacterium. So we know the bacterium's actually got alternative reservoirs too from feeding by the psyllid. So in New Zealand, there's a low background population of TPP present in the environment all the time. Now, when you've got boxthorn, which certainly we do have a lot of boxthorn near potato fields in Canterbury, there's increased activity nearby and an edge effect, i.e. when the psyllids move out of the boxthorn, they move largely to the edge of the potato crop. They don't tend to go too far into it. It certainly will multiply and it'll feed and multiply on the potato crop, but doesn't disperse particularly far unless there's some reason to disturb it, for example, desiccation or any sort of mechanical movement through the crop. So they prefer to stay where they largely first arrive. So host plant species alone were not decisive in determining the phloem salivation and ingestion. So this is all part of the EPG, looking at the saliva, the probing and feeding behaviour of the TPP. In particular, salivation is important in terms of the pump that actually pushes, helps deliver the bacteria out of the psyllid into the plant, and ingestion, of course, is acquiral of bacteria back into the TPP. Most interestingly, the infection status, so whether the TPP contained or did not contain the bacteria, did affect its determining its feeding behaviour. So positive TPP were more likely to salivate, i.e. to push the bacteria into the plant, than TPP that were negative for the bacteria, whilst negative TPP were more likely to ingest. So they didn't salivate so hard, but they were more interested in acquiring. So they would also therefore acquire any bacteria that was present in a plant. Jessica and her team also looked at the preference of host plants in terms of both the development and fecundity, so the ability to produce live offspring. And you can see from that graph behind me that, generally speaking, Poroporo was the optimal host for most of the biological characteristics. So that would be kangaroo paw here in Australia. The production crops generally are not the most preferred hosts for this insect. So understanding the ecology of what's happening around those fields is quite important in terms of overall management. So I'll just shift now a little bit to our CSO specific diagnostics. So from 2002 and 2156, there are a range of 16S based ribosome 16S ribosomal RNA-based diagnostics. That's the standard bacterial diagnostic that's been used for a long time. The Leotel is certainly mandated in the NDP 18, the Candidata Liberibacter Solidinacearum National Diagnostic Protocol. But all of those tests are effectively targeting the same region, and we do know that there are issues with 16S-based diagnostics. It does give false positives, and that was one of the reasons, one of the drivers behind the project that Brendan described earlier today. Also in this context, Jackie's already described her Brunswickiensis. We can, if you don't get the PCR conditions right, generate a false positive for the LSO specific diagnostic using Brunswickiensis. We also have found and now reported Liberibacter terratania, so that's from the New Zealand native fuchsia psyllid. And it can be found, that particular bacteria can be found in fairly high titers in that native psyllid. That will also generate a false positive to the Beard et al. Assay that we often use in New Zealand when we're looking at Liberibacter populations. So we know there are issues, and we also, in last year, this is just 2017, these were published, there was another subspecies of Africanus published or found and described by Gerhard Peterson's group. So the environment is getting more and more complex. There's more findings of Liberibacters, and we know that Africanus will give a false positive, as will Asiaticus to some of the assays as well. So you've seen this diagram before. Basically, that genomic approach to identifying loci. Interestingly, most of them are hypothetical proteins, which initially I would not have gone near in terms of diagnostic targets, but ultimately we would prove that these are very, very robust diagnostic targets. And we developed a new diagnostic that's not 16S based for Liberibacter. So it's part of the WA incursion. Both Sarah and I participated in the science advisory group for the diagnostic and provided input and our experience with Liberibacter diagnostics in terms of what the guys in Monica and Brenda were trying to do. We also have an international, we've also, as Brendan said, we have international links to both the US and Finland and other groups like France in terms of the work we've been doing around generating genomes. So we do have a fairly rich resource of genomic data as well as diagnostic data for CLSO. The new diagnostic was used to screen some of the material that was coming out of WA. That was done in Brendan's lab. It generated no false positives. This was at a time when they were sort of struggling to, they weren't finding anything and becoming a little bit uncertain about whether the diagnostic was working. And as part of that, we also hosted Monica Kehoe from WA for 3 weeks at Lincoln, where Monica actually got to run PCRs on positive samples and get confidence that the assay was working, the sampling was working, the strategy was working, so she could go back and really have a decent crack at the samples that were coming into the lab in Perth. So how was the knowledge used? So basically Jessica spent at least a week at one point over in WA helping do some knowledge transfer. Certainly I sat on the phone or an email, was emailing our colleagues in Perth around the diagnostic issues. So the host plant list that Jessica generated was used to inform surveillance and monitoring. So it's important that not just crops are monitored, it's all those other things that are out there. She gave various presentations to the operational team on how to do surveillance for TPP, how to recognise TPP and what sort of symptoms you'll see from feeding on various plants. And just some general experience about how we do things in New Zealand in terms of trying to manage this bacteria and its vector for quite some length of time. As I noted before, we provided, from the diagnostic perspective, we had input into the Science Advisory Group. The new diagnostic was certainly available to Victoria to assist WA in their screening efforts, and we did our utmost to share our experience through hosting Monica and other correspondents and provide access to positive material for their purposes. So at that point I can hand over to Sonya.
Thank you, Grant, for the New Zealand perspective. I'm just going to give the Western Australia perspective now. So we detected TPP in February 2017, and from memory it was a Friday, which is when all good incursions occur. And it was interesting because it was detected in an urban backyard, and simultaneously we had a report from a crop scout. And I guess this highlighted one of the issues that we do have in reporting biosecurity issues, is that the crop scout was very worried about their business. Were they actually going to be blacklisted by growers because they did report TPP? And unfortunately, the person who made the ID that worked for that crop scout no longer works for that company. So it is a bit of a risk, and I don't know how that is addressed in the future. I know that's an issue that needs to be considered. When we started looking for the psyllid, we found that it was widespread in the Perth metropolitan area. And we still to this day do not know where TPP came from. We suspect that it may have come from something being smuggled in from New Zealand. We do know that the biotype is the same as what's been detected in Norfolk Island as well as New Zealand. In terms of preparedness for a TPP incursion, there was a national diagnostic protocol that was available. There was also a threat-specific contingency plan for zebra chip that was available through Plant Health Australia, and there was a national surveillance program that had been implemented in 2011. I'd just like to point out that for the national surveillance system, Western Australia was not actually included. Part of that may be because it was never expected that TPP would occur in Western Australia first rather than the rest of Eastern Australia. And one thing I do want to highlight, all the trapping is being conducted in commercial potato areas, but our experience indicates that that may not be where it occurs first. So I know with several surveillance systems for exotic pests and diseases is that there needs to be more focus on the urban area or the peri-urban area, because that's where incursions can occur. So there were quite a few issues that we had with diagnostics, and some of those have still not been resolved. So what we found after that it was decided nationally that TPP could not be eradicated was that the next step would be to determine whether CLso was present in Western Australia or not. So Western Australia used what was known as a fry screen, which was basically chopping up potatoes, so mostly red potatoes because there was no seed potatoes left at the time, and then frying them as it suggests. So, and what happens is that because of the starches in potatoes, if zebra chip is present, it shows up as different sort of bands of colour. So we did those because we needed a bulk screening technique, and unfortunately when it came down to it, that technique was not accepted nationally. So we still have no agreed protocol that's available for bulk testing of samples. So basically what Grant was alluding to was that Monica Kehoe went across to New Zealand and she looked at some bulk testing. So she looked at pooling samples of psyllids. There were hot psyllids, which are the ones that have the CLso, as well as cold psyllids, and seeing if you could actually use bulk testing to determine if CLso is present or not. And she found that you could do that. And luckily that protocol has been accepted nationally, and what we're looking forward to now is the new diagnostic protocol being accepted. Another issue that we had, and I'm sure this is one that's going to continue to be had by biosecurity throughout Australia, is that the issue of a host list. So with Tomato Potato Psyllid, there was a lot of historical information available. So we're talking about things from the 1930s onwards. And the way they kept records at that time wasn't the best. So we decided, so there's basically 20 plant families that can be affected or can host a psyllid, but is it a true host or is it a transient host? So what we've decided to do is basically settle on a definition of what a host plant actually is, and those of you who've done PhDs on this subject probably don't understand why this is being revisited, but unfortunately it was for TPP. So basically a host plant is something on which an insect can basically breed and reach maturity on. Partial hosts are one which they can partially develop. So what we've come to is an agreement on what a true host is, and also what other crops the psyllid may be able to travel on in terms of market access. So shortly after TPP was detected in Western Australia, we had market access issues with true hosts as well as what we call non-host or carrier hosts for TPP. And these included ornamentals such as cut flowers that were also native species, strawberries, pome fruit and other vegetables such as broccoli and lettuce. So it was basically that the proximity of these crops to tomato potato psyllid infected crops rendered them a possible carrier host. Another issue that it's not really an issue, but it's basically something you need to keep in mind if you think that all the research has been done on a particular pest or disease, is that often you can't actually totally transfer international research to Australian conditions. So for example, when we were looking at what insecticides our growers could actually use to treat for TPP, we found that the insecticides, particularly those that were effective in New Zealand, weren't available for use in Western Australia, or not just Western Australia, across Australia, and they're still not available to date because they need to be registered through the APVMA, and that can be quite a big process. And following Barnaby Joyce's decision to move the APVMA, it might take a little bit longer. We also found that, interestingly, some of the insecticides that were regarded to be very effective overseas didn't actually work under our conditions, and we're not sure why that was, but permetrazine, which is also known as chess, basically didn't work at all. We found that some of the non-crop hosts, such as boxthorn mentioned by Grant, that are present in New Zealand, aren't widely grown in Western Australia at least, so that shouldn't be an issue for us. And we've also got a different cropping system in Western Australia, and that will vary across Australia. Obviously, Western Australia is a relatively small player in terms of horticulture, so it might behave differently when it gets to other horticultural regions. Another issue with the biology, for example, of TPP is that where it's been recorded in the USA, Mexico and South America, is that the conditions are quite different in terms of temperature. So we expected, for example, that TPP would be limited in its survival when it got above 30 degrees Celsius. As you know, during our summers, not just in Western Australia but across Australia, the temperatures can easily get above 30 degrees. We can get heat waves, and TPP is still able to survive under those conditions. So how it does that, we're not exactly sure at present. Oh, okay, I had another slide in there. Basically, in conclusion, it's great to have materials that are available, and we definitely made use of those, but you just have to be aware that there are limitations, particularly when it comes to using diagnostic protocols, because they may not be tested in terms of bulk sampling, which is one of the issues that we really struggled with. To date, we haven't found any CLso present in Western Australia, and I believe that happened previously in Canada, but it seems to be a bit of a precedent. We did do a lot of samples. We collected hundreds, actually thousands of plant samples, TPP, and tested them for CLso. We did not find CLso. So going forward, we're continuing to conduct surveillance to determine that CLso is still absent from Western Australia. Thank you.